This is ITV News, the Chancellor's Statement Special, with Tom Bradby.
When the Chancellor announced some chunky tax rises last October, claiming to be surprised, shocked, I tell you, at the scale of the black hole she found in the public finances, we thought that might be an end to the pain, but chance would be a fine thing. Today, we are expected to see more of the same, mostly in the form of spending cuts. But what exactly? And will there be surprises? Thankfully, we have our top team of experts here to answer some of those questions for you. Robert, set the scene for us. What do we expect from today?
So, very significant announcements of spending cuts. And the reason, in a way, this is so shocking is in October, she put up taxes by £40 billion. And the reason she did that was she said she was going to fix the public finances. 6 months later, she's going to have to admit that her own rules for keeping the public finances in shape have already been breached. So she is going to have to find, I don't know, something in the order of 20 billion quid of cost savings, because she says she's already made it clear she's not going to put taxes up this time. She's going to have to find something, as I say, order of 20 billion of cost savings, so that she can again look the nation in the eye and say, you know, the public finances are not running out of control. Unfortunately, that won't be the end of the story for this year, simply because the margin of protection that she's building in will be tiny. And she's taking a bit of a bet that the economic conditions aren't going to deteriorate again in the next few months. But I have to say, where I sit, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more about this stage in the programme, I do think there's a big risk that in another 6 months, when we get what will be at that point admitted to be a proper budget, we may see taxes going up.
OK, Anushka, if that's the scene, if you like, what can she do?
Well, look, Rachel Reeves definitely has a headache, which I think is summed up quite well in this chart from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which looks at shrinking headroom. Headroom is the wriggle room a chancellor has to remain within fiscal rules. It used to be quite big years ago. You can see that in the toolbars, but it has got very small. The final bar at the last budget, 9.9 billion. Now, something it has since disappeared completely, and today's changes are just about restoring it. So, what is she doing? Number one, a big package of welfare reforms we've talked about a lot. So tightening up the test for disability benefit PIP, changing universal credit, but also ploughing money back in, 1.4 billion, including £1 billion for employment support, although not freezing PIP. That was taken out of the plans after an MP backlash. Now, the government said this would save a net £5 billion. But we revealed last night that the Office for Budget Responsibility, which marks the government's homework, disagrees. It predicts £3.4 billion of net savings. And even to get there, they've had to find an extra £500 million of cuts. So that is welfare. But what about public spending by departments? That has been due to rise by 1.3% in real terms, so over inflation on average. But the Resolution Foundation's Emily Fry assumes in her model that they will continue to increase money for the NHS, that schools will be protected, and we know that defence spending is going to rise, which would mean a squeeze on unprotected departments like local government, justice, Home Office, down £9.7 billion in cash terms under her model. Now, Robert has revealed that Reeves will tighten that spending envelope. If it falls to 1.1%, that squeeze would be more like £14.8 billion on unprotected departments. And if Reeves went further on defence to get to the 3% by 2030, as some are demanding, the squeeze would hit £25.6 billion. So difficult even before we talk about growth.
Anushka, thank you very much. Joel, I guess one question many people watching this will have is, talk us through the fiscal rules, and does it really matter if she breaks them? And if so, why?
Well, I think if you've spent the last 6 months running around telling everyone that the fiscal rules you have just written for yourself, and let's be clear, there's a merit to them, a value of sorts, I suppose, to publicly bind your hand in a way that you hope will win the confidence of investors, that you're in charge of the things that really matter, Tom. But if you've just written those rules and then you break them at the first time of asking politically, that's a very difficult look. And I think there is the worry that actually you'll just end up spooking the markets. And the market view does matter, Tom. Let's just take a step back, because it's always worth remembering. The British government spends more than it raises in tax. It has done for most of my lifetime, most of everyone's lifetimes. Now, that means debt is rising because it has to fund the difference by borrowing. Debt is not bad. Unsustainable debt is very bad. And when you speak to fund managers, they point out that the British government, so these are the people who help make investments on behalf of pension funds, on behalf of insurers, on behalf of wealthy foreign investors who the British government relies on to lend it money. And what they will say is, look at what's happened to the British government's debt interest payments. Before COVID, so not so long ago, we were spending around 40 billion pounds a year servicing our interest costs. Now, and the OBR will confirm this today, it's in excess of 100 billion pounds a year. That is an enormous difference. That's the education budget, more or less. That is twice getting on for the defence budget, and obviously we'll be talking about that later in the programme. The impression you get when you speak to fund managers is that Britain really is running now into the constraints on what it can affordably borrow. You can always find someone who will lend you money. It's a question of how much they charge you to do that. And I think that is a massive problem. There's another issue, the Truss effect. As one fund manager put it to me, the UK is living with a post-Truss fiscal hangover. The UK is on probation, Tom. Rachel Reeves today has to be on best behaviour.
We need to take a break in just a moment before we get to the Chancellor's statement. But Robert, before we do, just briefly, can I ask you to pick up on what Joel was saying there? How worried do you think the Chancellor is going into today?
Look, the Chancellor knows, everything that Joel has just outlined in terms of the constraints that are on her in respect of how much she can borrow. Many of her colleagues have said, look at Germany, which has just announced massive increases in borrowing to fund huge investment both in infrastructure, something we could do within this country, and in defence, something that we are planning, although we're not being as ambitious as Germany. But the big difference is that the ratio of our debt to GDP is over 100%, whereas in Germany it's still sort of 63, 64%. So they have more room for manoeuvre in that sense in terms of taking on more debt. I think it is important to point out, however, that this is a government that's only been in office for 6 months. There was a very powerful chart in the FT this morning, derived from IMF figures. The British problem is that since 2019, our debt has increased more as a share of our national output than any other comparable country. The previous government, for all the Tories are now attacking Rachel Reeves, were, many people would say, utterly reckless with the British public sector balance sheet. And whatever mistakes you think Rachel Reeves has made, this is their mess, which she is trying to clear up.
OK, we will be back to bring you the Chancellor's statement after this short break. Do stay with us.
Children reunited with their families, and in specific reference to his question, the UK is playing our full part in international efforts, including funding the Bring Kids Back initiative through the Partnership Fund for a Resilient Ukraine. And I want to reassure the whole House will do everything we can to see these children returned and reintegrated as safely and as quickly as is possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The 7-year-old adoptive daughter of my constituent Sarah suffered immense trauma in her early years. Thanks to support from the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund, she's been able to access much-needed therapy that's helped her progress. But she and thousands of others don't know if they'll be able to get more help, because in just 5 days, that fund ends and ministers have repeatedly refused to confirm whether it will continue. So can the Prime Minister give a cast-iron guarantee to vulnerable children, adoptive parents and kinship carers that he won't cut this fund, and so that, in Sarah's words, she can give her daughter the absolute best second chance in life she deserves?
Well, we will set out details just as soon as we can on the basis of the principles that I set out earlier. The scheme overall, in terms of welfare, is not defendable on terms, but it must be a scheme that supports those that need it, and the details will be set out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. While our nation was being engulfed last year by racist riots in Slough, Christians, Hindus, Jews, Sikhs, people of faith and no faith openly declared that if anybody tried to attack a mosque in our town, we'd stand in solidarity with our local Muslim community to protect it. However, since then, many have become more fearful with a rise in Islamophobic attacks, including this month at a mosque in Aberdeen. So can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, confirm to the country what steps is the government taking to tackle such hate crime and promote community cohesion so that those seeking to divide our British society are not allowed to succeed?
Well, I thank him for his question. He does great work to bring our communities together, especially in Slough. Look, any form of racial or religious-based hatred is abhorrent and has no place in society. We have set aside over £50 million to protect faith communities and freedom of worship. That's the right thing to do. It's a shame that we have to do it. And our £15 million Community Recovery Fund has been supporting communities affected by the disorder last summer. Again, the right thing to do, but it's a shame that we have to do it.
Sir Roger Gale.
Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the problems faced by Heathrow earlier in the week have highlighted again the fact that since the closure of Manston Airport in Kent, South East lacks a major diversion facility. Now, one diversion facility would not, of course, have compensated for the closure of Heathrow, a major hub airport. But would the Prime Minister agree that with the reopening of Manston planned for October 2028, there will be a significant contribution to resilience of aviation in the South East?
Well, look, he's right to raise the concern about the situation in Heathrow. I think everybody is very concerned by what happened last week. There are clearly questions that need to be answered on a number of fronts in relation to what happened, and an investigation is ongoing. But I'm not going to announce particular parts of our policy and strategy here at this stage.
Irene Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of
Welcome back to this special programme on the Spring Statement, a budget and an all but name. I think it's fair to say this is the scene in the House of Commons chamber right now. Prime Minister's Questions is going on, packed as it always is for Prime Minister's Questions, but also because, as we've been discussing, this is a big economic event today, more than we might normally expect, and therefore pretty much everyone who's everyone has turned up to see it. Joel, can I just ask you to pick up on something Robert was saying? Because I think a lot of people will be wondering, why is our debt such a problem? How does it compare to the Germanys, to the Frances, to the Japans, to the Canadas, to the US, to the other leading industrialised nations? And where are we vis-à-vis them?
Well, we are not the only wealthy country to be running very high levels of debt relative to the size of our economy, Tom. France's levels of debt are slightly higher than ours. Germany is very different. Their situation is extremely different. There's space there potentially for the government to do what it is already indicating it will, to borrow more, not least to fund an increase in defence spending. What has happened in recent years has been staggering, actually, and we forget about it. And I think... maybe it's the trauma of COVID, I don't know, but the British government during COVID borrowed extraordinary, eye-popping sums of money to support, let's be clear, households and businesses through a time when great chunks of the economy shut down altogether, and then we had an energy price shock, and the government decided during that period that it was going to support households, in particular with their energy bills. Hundreds of billions of pounds were spent. The stock of national debt has risen significantly. The other thing, obviously, that's happened in recent years is interest rates have risen and inflation has also risen, which has made the cost of that debt has become much more expensive to service. So if you look as I am, because I'll be watching this today, at the market, so the governments borrow money by issuing bonds, sort of IOUs, and investors hopefully buy those bonds. If you look this morning, as before the Chancellor stands up, for the government to borrow over a 10-year period, the yield on 10-year government debt is around 4.7%, right? That's the effective interest rate to borrow over that period. If you go back before COVID, the government was borrowing at below 1%. There's been a really big change, and that's completely shifted the dynamics. Robert's absolutely right. Rachel Reeves has inherited a real mess, and it's desperately bad at the moment. But at some stage, she will start to have to take responsibility for it.
Anushka, the picture you painted of potential cuts looked potentially pretty bleak in some departments. Is your best guess that was the height of it, that they've effectively given us already the indication of the pain that's in today, or are we going to get some nasty surprises on the floor here?
Well, what we're going to get today is the envelope for spending. What we're not going to get is the actual decision-making on how that spending comes down. That comes next in June in the spending review. And when I talk to people in government, some of them say to me, that's what's giving them sleepless nights, the actual decision-making they have to make on what goes from department to department. We also know that they're doing this zero-based review, so they are getting every department to go through every single line of their spending and highlight the lowest 20% of it, which is obviously very difficult. Some people are messaging me today saying it is about choices. You don't have to slash welfare. You don't have to do this squeeze. You could do what Germany's doing, but obviously for the reasons that Robert has set out, they're very nervous of doing that in the Treasury. I should say one thing they do not want us to say in the Treasury, there is a word they do not want us to use, and they're right to say it, is austerity. They're very, very clear. This is not austerity. They've put lots of money into departments already, into the NHS, a huge amount. And what I was showing you there was real terms increases, but real terms increases by less than before. And across government, there are trade-offs. If you want to fund defence and you want to fund the NHS, then very, very clearly, departments like Justice, local government, like Home Office are very nervous about that.
Robert, I mean, I always worry on days like today, at least in the recent past, you couldn't confuse any of us for a ray of sunshine because it's not always full of tremendously good news, as Joel has just outlined. Are there any reasons for optimism you see in the performance of the economy generally at the moment? I mean, is it as bleak as I'm sometimes making out?
So look, there are two grounds for sort of medium-term optimism, and actually at the moment I'm definitely in the glass half full camp.
We like that.
But they are not things that will materialise in terms of people's living standards anytime soon. One is, as I've said for a year and a half now, I do think this artificial intelligence industrial revolution is going to be really powerful, and with the right kind of both government and business leadership, actually it will improve living standards over the next few years and will allow some of the savings they need to make in public services to be made without people feeling that the quality of the public service is deteriorating. And then something else really important that's going on in response to Trump is that all of the advanced economies outside of the US are thinking about how they deal with this growth problem in a much more imaginative and bold way than we have been seeing up to now. I've talked about the massive investments that Germany is making. We are beginning in our own defence sector to see the basis of an industrial policy based on investment in defence that could have really quite positive spin-offs for the civil sector, and we are getting closer to Europe in an economic sense.
I have to interrupt you because the Chancellor is on her feet.
Was elected to bring change to our country, to provide security for working people and to deliver a decade of national renewal. That work began in July, and I am proud of what we have delivered in just 9 months. Restoring stability to our public finances, giving the Bank of England the foundation to cut interest rates 3 times since the general election, rebuilding our public services with record investment in our NHS, bringing waiting lists down for 5 months in a row, and increasing the national living wage to give 3 million people a pay rise from next week. Now our task is to secure Britain's future in a world that is changing before our eyes. The threat facing our continent was transformed when Putin invaded Ukraine. It has since escalated further, and that continue to evolve rapidly. At the same time, the global economy has become more uncertain, bringing insecurity at home as trading patterns become more unstable and borrowing costs rise for many major economies. Mr. Speaker, the job of a responsible government is not simply to watch this change. This moment demands an active government, a government not stepping back, but stepping up. A government on the side of working people, helping Britain to reach its potential. And, Mr. Speaker, we have the strength to do just that. As one of the world's largest economies, an ally to trading partners across the globe, and a hub for global innovation. These strengths and the progress that we have made so far mean that we can act quickly and decisively in a more uncertain world to secure Britain's future and to deliver prosperity for working people. Mr. Speaker, as I set out at the budget last year, I am today returning to the House to provide an update on our public finances, supported by a new forecast from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. Ahead of a full spending review in June, I will then return to the House in the autumn to deliver a budget in line with our commitment to deliver just one major fiscal event a year. So let me now turn to the OBR's forecasts. And I want to thank Richard Hughes and his team for their dedicated work. The increased global uncertainty has had two consequences. First, on our public finances, and second, on our economy. I will take each in turn. In the autumn, I set out our new fiscal rules that would guide this government. These fiscal rules are non-negotiable. They are the embodiment of this government's unwavering commitment to bring stability to our economy and to ensure security for working people. Because the British people have seen what happens when a government borrows beyond their means. The mini-budget delivered by the party opposite resulted in higher bills, in higher rents and higher mortgages. And, Mr. Speaker, it was not the wealthy who suffered most when they crushed the economy. It was ordinary working people. And they continue to feel the effects 2.5 years later of the damage that the party opposite did. Now, let me be clear. There is nothing progressive, there is nothing Labour about working people paying the price for economic irresponsibility. British people put their trust in this Labour government because they knew that I would never take risks with the public finances, that we would never do anything to put household finances in danger, and we must earn that trust every single day. The two rules that I set out at the budget were first, our stability rule, which ensures that public spending is under control, balancing the current budget by 2029-30, so that day-to-day spending is met by tax receipts. Second, our investment rule, to drive growth in the economy, ensuring that net financial debt falls by the end of the forecast period, while enabling us to invest alongside business. Turning first to the stability rule, the OBR's forecast shows that before the steps that I will take in this statement, the current budget would have been in deficit by £4.1 billion in 2029-30, having been in surplus by £9.9 billion in the autumn, as the UK, alongside our international peers like France and Germany, has seen the cost of borrowing rise during this period of heightened uncertainty in global markets. As a result of the steps that I am taking today, I can confirm that I have restored in full our headroom against the stability rule, moving from a deficit of £36.1 billion in 2025-26 and £13.4 billion in 2026-27 to a surplus of £6.0 billion in 27-28, £7.1 billion in 2028-29, and a surplus of £9.9 billion in 2029-30. compares to the headroom left by the previous government of just £6.5 billion. That means we are continuing to meet the stability rule 2 years early, building resilience to shocks in this, a more uncertain world. The OBR forecast that the investment rule is also met 2 years early, with net financial debt of 82.9% of GDP in 25-26 and 83.5% in 26-27, before falling to 83.4% in 27-28, in 83.2% in 2028-29, and then to 82.7% in 2029-30, providing headroom of £15.1 billion in the final year of the forecast, broadly unchanged from the autumn. After the last government doubled the national debt, debt interest payments now stand at £105.2 billion this year. Mr. Speaker, that is more than we allocate to defence, the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice combined. That is the legacy of the party opposite. So the responsible choice is to reduce our levels of debt and borrowing in the years ahead so that we can spend more on the priorities of working people, and that is exactly what this government will do. Mr. Speaker, I said that our fiscal rules were non-negotiable, and I meant it. I will always deliver economic stability, and I will always put working people first. I said it at the election, I said it at the budget, and I say it again today. Let me now set out the steps that the government has taken. At the budget, we protected working people by keeping our promise not to raise their rates of national insurance, income tax or VAT. At the same time, we began to rebuild our public services after the party opposite left a £22 billion black hole in our public finances. Ours were the right choices for stability and the right choices for renewal, funded by the decisions that we took on tax. As I promised in the autumn, this statement does not contain any further tax increases. But when working people are paying their taxes while still struggling with the cost of living, it cannot be right that others are still evading what they rightly owe in tax. In the budget, I delivered the most ambitious package of measures that we have ever seen to cut down on tax evasion, raising £6.5 billion per year by the end of the forecast. Today, I go further, continuing our investment in cutting-edge technology, investing in the HMRC's capacity to crack down on tax avoidance, and setting out plans to increase the number of tax fraudsters charged every year by 20%. These changes raise a further £1 billion, taking the total revenue raised from reducing tax evasion under this Labour government to £7.5 billion. These figures are verified by the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I want to thank my honourable friend, the Exchequer Secretary, for his continued work in this area. Mr. Speaker, last week, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, set out this government's plans to reform the welfare system. The Labour Party is the party of work. We believe that if you can work, you should work. But if you can't work, you should be properly supported. This government inherited a broken system. More than 1,000 people every day are qualifying for personal independence payments. 1 in 8 young people are not in employment, education or training. If we do nothing, we are writing off an entire generation. That cannot be right, and we will not stand for it. It is a waste of their potential, and it is a waste of their futures, and we will change it. As my right honourable friend said in her statement last week, the final costings would be subject to the OBR's assessment. Today, the OBR have said that they estimate that the package will save £4.8 billion in the welfare budget, reflecting their judgments on behavioural effects and wider factors. This also reflects final adjustments to the overall package, consistent with the Secretary of State's statement last week and the government's Pathways to Work Green Paper. The Universal Credit Standard Allowance will increase from £92 per week in 25-26 to £106 a week by 29-30, while the Universal Credit Health element will be cut for new claimants by around 50% and then frozen. On top of this, we are investing £1 billion to provide guaranteed, personalised employment support to help people back into work. And £400 million to support the Department for Work and Pensions and our job centres to deliver these changes effectively and fairly, taking total savings after that to the package to £3.4 billion. While spending on disability and sickness benefits will continue to rise, these plans mean that welfare spending as a share of GDP will fall between 2026 and the end of the forecast period, very different to what we inherited from the party opposite. We are reforming our welfare system, making it more sustainable, protecting the most vulnerable, and most importantly, supporting more people back into secure work, lifting them out of poverty. Mr. Speaker, at the budget, I fixed the foundations of our economy to deliver on the promise of change. That work has already begun. 2 million extra appointments in our NHS. Waiting lists down. New breakfast clubs opening across England. The largest settlements in real terms for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in the history of devolution. Asylum costs falling, promises made, promises kept, and every single one of them opposed by the parties opposite. At the budget, alongside providing an increase in funding for this year and next, I set the envelope for the spending review, which we will deliver in June, led by my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to set departmental budgets until 28-29 for day-to-day spending and until 2029-30 for capital spending. Today, I'm reflecting two steps that we have taken on our spending plans. First, because we are living in an uncertain world, as the Prime Minister has set out, we will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, reducing overseas aid to 0.3% of gross national income. This means we save £2.6 billion in day-to-day spending in 2029-30 to fund our more capital-intensive defence commitments. Second, in recent months, we have begun to fundamentally reform the British state, driving efficiency and productivity across government to deliver tangible savings and improve services across our country. Earlier this the Prime Minister set out plans to abolish the arm's-length body NHS England and ensure that that money goes directly to improving the service for patients. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, is driving forward vital reforms to increase NHS productivity, bearing down on costly agency spend to save money so that we can improve patient care. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, is taking forward work to significantly reduce the costs of running government by 15%, worth £2 billion by the end of the decade. This work shows that we can make our state leaner and more agile, delivering more resources to the front line, while ensuring that we control day-to-day spending to meet our fiscal rules. Today, I build on that work by bringing forward £3.25 billion of investment to deliver the reforms that our public services need through a new transformation fund. That is money brought forward now to bring down the costs of running government by the end of the forecast period, by making public services more efficient, more productive and more focused on the user. I can confirm today the first allocations from this fund, including funding for voluntary exit schemes to reduce the size of the civil service, pioneering AI tools to modernise the state, investment in technology for the Ministry of Justice to deliver probation services more effectively, and upfront investment so we can support more children into foster care to give them the best possible start in life and reduce cost pressures in the future. Our work to make government leaner, more productive and more efficient will help deliver a further £3.5 billion of day-to-day savings by 2029-30. Overall, day-to-day spending will be reduced by £6.1 billion in 2029-30. and it will now grow by an average of 1.2% a year above inflation, compared to 1.3% in the autumn. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm to the House that day-to-day spending will increase in real terms above inflation in every single year of the forecast. And in the spending review, apart from the reductions in overseas aid, day-to-day spending across government has been fully protected. I can also confirm our approach to capital investment. In the autumn budget, I announced £100 billion of additional capital spending to crowd in investment from the private sector, to fix our crumbling infrastructure, and to create jobs in every corner of our country. Today, I am not cutting capital spending, as the party opposite did, time and time again, because that choked off growth, and it left our school roofs literally crumbling. That was the wrong choice. It was the irresponsible choice. It was the Tory choice. Today, I am instead increasing capital spending by an average of £2 billion per year compared with the autumn, to drive growth in our economy and to deliver in full our vital commitments on defence. This government will ensure that every pound we spend will deliver for the British people by increasing productivity, driving growth in our economy and improving our frontline public services. Mr. Speaker, let me turn now to the impact of increased uncertainty on our economy. To deliver economic stability, we must work closely with the Bank of England, supporting the Independent Monetary Policy Committee to meet their 2% inflation target. There have been 3 interest rate cuts since the general election, and today's data showed that inflation fell in February. Having peaked at 11% under the previous government, the OBR forecast that CPI inflation will average 3.2% this year before falling rapidly to 2.1% in 2026 and meeting the 2% target from 2027 onwards, giving families and businesses the security that they need and providing our economy with the stable platform it needs to grow. Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, the OECD downgraded this year's growth forecast for every G7 economy, including the UK. And the OBR have today revised down our growth forecast for 2025, from 2% in the autumn to 1% today. I am not satisfied with these numbers, and that is why we, on this side of the House, are serious about taking the action needed to grow our economy. Backing the builders, not the blockers, with a 3rd runway at Heathrow Airport and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Increasing investment with reforms to our pension system and a new national wealth fund. And tearing down regulatory barriers in every sector of our economy. That is a serious plan for growth. That is a serious plan to improve living standards. That is a serious plan to renew our country. Mr. Speaker, a changing world presents challenges, but it also presents new opportunities for new jobs and new contracts in our world-class defence industrial centres, from Belfast to Deeside and from Plymouth to Rosyth. In February, the Prime Minister set out our government's commitment to increase spending on defence to 2.5% of GDP from April 2027, the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, with an ambition to spend 3% of GDP on defence in the next Parliament. That was the right decision in a more insecure world, putting an extra £6.4 billion into defence spending by 2027. But we have to move quickly in this changing world, and that starts with investment. So today I can confirm that I will provide an additional £2.2 billion for the Ministry of Defence in the next financial year, a further down payment on our plans to deliver 2.5% of GDP by 2027. This additional investment is not just about increasing our national security, but increasing our economic security too. As defence spending rises, I want the whole country to feel its benefits. So I will now set out the immediate steps that we are taking to boost Britain's defence industry and to make the UK a defence industrial superpower. We will spend a minimum of 10% of the Ministry of Defence's equipment budget on new novel technologies, including drones and AI-enabled technology, driving forward advanced manufacturing production in places like Glasgow, in Derby and in Newport, creating demand for highly skilled engineers and scientists, and delivering new business opportunities for UK tech firms and start-ups. We will establish a protected budget of £400 million within the Ministry of Defence, a budget that will rise over time for UK defence innovation, with a clear mandate to bring innovative technology to the front line at speed. And we will reform our broken defence procurement system, making it quicker, more agile and more streamlined, and giving small businesses across the UK better access to Ministry of Defence contracts, something welcomed by the Federation of Small Businesses. We will take forward our plan for Barrow, a town at the heart of our nuclear security, working with my honourable friend, the member for Barrow and Furness, and providing £200 million, supporting the creation of thousands of jobs there. We will regenerate Portsmouth Naval Base, securing its future, as called for by my honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth South. We will secure better homes for thousands of military families, the homes that they deserve, denied to them by the previous government. Homes for our military families in constituencies of my honourable friends for Plymouth Moorview, Plymouth Sutton and Devonport, York Outer and in Aldershot. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. Finally, Mr Speaker, we will provide £2 billion of increased capacity for UK export finance to provide loans for overseas buyers of UK defence goods and services, because I want to do more with our defence budget so we can buy and make and sell things here in Britain. Giving further opportunities for our world-leading defence companies and those who work in them to grow and create jobs here in Britain as military spending rightly increases all across Europe. To oversee all of this vital work, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary and I will establish a new Defence Growth Board to maximise the benefits from every pound of taxpayers' money that we spend. And we will put defence at the heart of our modern industrial strategy to drive innovation that can deliver huge benefits back into the British economy. Mr Speaker, that is how we make our country a defence industrial superpower. So the skills of the future, the jobs of the future and the opportunities of the future can be found right here in the United Kingdom. Mr Speaker, as the previous government learned to their detriment, there are no shortcuts to economic growth. It will take long-term decisions. It will take hard yards. It will take time for the reforms that we are introducing to be felt in the everyday economy. It is right that the Office for Budget Responsibility consider the evidence and look carefully at measures before recognising a growth impact in their forecast. But, Mr Speaker, I can announce to the House that the OBR have considered and have scored one of the central planks of our plan for growth. In my first week as Chancellor, I announced that we were pursuing the most ambitious set of planning reforms in decades to get Britain building again. And in December, we published changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, driven forward tirelessly by my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister. Reintroducing mandatory housing targets and bringing grey belt land into scope. The OBR have today concluded that these reforms will permanently increase the level of real GDP by 0.2% in 29-30, an additional £6.8 billion for our economy, and by 0.4% of GDP within 10 years, an additional £15.1 billion in our British economy. Mr Speaker, that is the biggest positive growth impact that the OBR have ever reflected in their forecast for a policy with no fiscal cost. And taken together with our plans to increase capital spending that we set out in the budget last year, This government's policies will increase the level of real GDP by 0.6% in the next 10 years. Mr. Speaker, that is the difference that this Labour government is making. Policies to grow our economy. Promises by a Labour government, delivered by a Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, the planning system that we inherited was far too slow. The OBR have concluded that our reforms will lead to house building reaching a 40-year high. 305,000 homes a year by the end of the forecast period. And changes to the National Planning Policy Framework alone will help build over 1.3 million homes in the UK over the next 5 years, taking us within touching distance of delivering our manifesto promise to build 1.5 million homes in England in this Parliament. Homes promised by this Labour government, homes built by this Labour government, homes opposed by the parties opposite. The impact on our economy goes further still. I said at the election that we could not simply tax and spend our way to prosperity. We need economic growth. So I can today confirm that the effect of our growth policies, including our planning reforms, means an additional £3.4 billion to support our public finances and our public services by 2029-30. The proceeds of growth, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, we provided an additional £2 billion of investment in social and affordable homes next year, delivering up to 18,000 new homes and allowing local areas to bid for new development across our country, including sites in Thanet, in Sunderland and in Swindon. More security for families across our country, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government and opposed by the parties opposite. And to build these new homes, we need people with the right skills. Earlier this week, my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, announced more than £600 million to train up 60,000 more construction workers, including with 10 new technical excellence colleges across every region of our country, giving working people the chance to fulfil their potential. New opportunities for our young people, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, all this is just the start. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill passed its second reading on Monday. No thanks to the parties opposite. Once this bill completes its passage, it will help deliver the homes and infrastructure our country badly needs. And I say to the parties opposite, the British people will be watching. Because if the parties opposite don't support these reforms, let us be clear about what that means. They are opposing economic growth. They are opposing more homes for families. They are opposing good jobs across our country. We on this side are clear about whose side we are on. The parties opposite must decide too. This Labour government is taking the right decisions now to secure Britain's future. And today I can confirm to the House that the OBR have upgraded their growth forecast next year and every single year thereafter. With GDP growth of 1.9% in 2026, of 1.8% in 2027, 1.7% in 2028 and 1.8% in 2029. Mr. Speaker, by the end of the forecast, our economy is larger compared to the OBR's forecast at the time of the budget. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. But, Mr. Speaker, this isn't just about lines on a graph. It's about improving people's lives. Working people are still feeling the pinch after a cost of living crisis caused by the party opposite that caused interest rates and inflation to go through the roof. So I am pleased that the OBR confirmed today that real household disposable income will now grow this year at almost twice the rate expected in the autumn. Compared to the forecast in the final budget delivered by the party opposite, and after taking into account inflation, the OBR say today that people will be, on average, over £500 a year better off under this Labour government. That will mean more money in the pockets of working people, higher living standards promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, the world is changing. We can see that and we can feel it. A changing world demands a government that is on the side of working people, acting in their interest, acting in the national interest, not retreating from challenges, not stepping back, but a government with the courage to step up, to secure Britain's future and to seize the opportunities that are out there before us. I am impatient for change. The British people are impatient for change after 14 years of failure. And we are beginning to see change happen. Our plan for change is working. Defence spending is rising. Waiting lists are falling. Wages are up. Interest rates are cut. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. And today, Mr. Speaker, the OBR confirm that our plan to get Britain building will drive growth in our economy and put more money in people's pockets. There are no quick fixes, but we have taken the right choices, returning stability to our economy after years of mismanagement by the party opposite, delivering security for our country and security for working people. That is what drives this government. That is what drives me as Chancellor. That is what drives the choices that I have set out today, and I commend this statement to the House.
Chancellor there, off her feet, announcing that some good news at the end. The OBR has decided their plans to build will contribute to growth, and growth is up in later years, if down this year. But let's hear what the Shadow Chancellor has immediately to say about it.
Public finances, stability to the public finances. But this statement, more appropriately referred to as an emergency budget, has brought her to a cold, hard...
Can I just say to you, quite rightly I want to hear to the Chancellor. I now want to hear the Shadow Chancellor. I don't need any help.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This emergency budget, Mr. Speaker, has brought the Right Honourable Lady to a cold, hard reckoning. She has become very fond recently to talk about the world having changed. Well, indeed it has, Mr. Speaker. This country was growing at the fastest rate in the G7 only about a year ago. And just as the OECD and the Bank of England and other forecasters, and now we learn today, the OBR have stated, growth has been halved in this year, cut in two as a consequence of the decisions and the choices that the Right Honourable Lady made on her watch. Inflation, which was down to 2%, bang on target on the very day of the last general election under a Conservative government. We are now told this year will be running at twice the level as was forecast under ourselves in 2024. This is going to mean prices bearing down on households and on businesses right across the country because of her choices. And the OBR also says, Mr. Speaker, that unemployment will be rising this year and next year.
And then we have the Shadow Chancellor, of course, doesn't get any advance notice of the spring statement, so having to respond and think on his feet there in terms of what we have just heard the Chancellor herself deliver to the House. Now, there was a lot in that. Some of it was expected, particularly on spending. There was some new information about growth, particularly the Chancellor clearly absolutely delighted that the OBR, the government's own numbers watchdog, does think their plans to change planning and to build, as they call it, are going to work and are going to contribute to growth. And so there was some shifting around in the growth numbers in later years. I'm going to ask Joel and Robert in particular to dig into that in a minute. But first, to Anushka for a summary of what we heard and what it means.
A summary of a little bit of it, if that's all right. Let's just run through what she set out. On growth, just looking at this year, 2025, the OBR had forecasted 2%. The Chancellor told us that has been downgraded to 1%. On welfare, she said welfare spending as a share of GDP will fall between 26-27 and the end of the forecast. She confirmed the original package announced last week with the changes to PIP and universal credit will go ahead. But as we expected, there was a sting in the tail, those additional £500 million of cuts, including the universal credit health element. After it is already cut by 50% for new claimants, it will now be frozen until the end of the decade. No inflation rises as originally planned. And Reeves confirmed the OBR has calculated £3.4 billion worth of savings, not 5. Now, on defence, again, confirmation they are raising spending to hit 2.5% of GDP by 2027, paid for, as we know, by reducing overseas aid by 0.3% of national income. She says that saves £2.6 billion in the final year of the decade. She's stuck with pushing the promise to get to 3% into the next Parliament, so she doesn't need to set that out at the moment, but she announced what she called a down payment on the first target, £2.2 billion extra for the Ministry of Defence in the next Parliament. On public spending, which we talked about before, she did tighten the public spending envelope, but not as far as some had feared. It was down from 1.3% increases to 1.2% in real terms.
OK, we'll come back to that in a minute. If you want to understand the budget, we can't call it a budget, spring statement in a nutshell, we're borrowing £105 billion a year. She lost her fiscal headroom, so she had to move to restore it, as she outlined, thus the spending cuts. And towards the end, there was a whole section on what she said was better news about growth, particularly around planning. Robert, your reaction?
So I'm just digging now into the official verdict of the Office for Budget Responsibility. I have to say it is considerably less upbeat than we got from Rachel Reeves at the end. So it says that in the course of this Parliament, growth will be 0.5 percentage point lower than it hoped for in the autumn. It says that productivity, which is core to all our prosperity, it's output per person working. You can't pay people more sustainably than productivity rises. It says that is going to be 1% lower in the course of the Parliament than it was hoping. Now, that's really bad news because productivity has been flatlining for 15 years, which is one of the reasons why our living standards have been flatlining for so long. And then it also just shows this extraordinary deterioration in the public finances from October to now, despite the fact that she raised that 40 billion in taxes in October. There was a surplus of 9.9 billion, in 4 to 5 years' time. That's come down to minus 4.4 billion pounds, and that's why she's had to cut public spending and cut welfare.
Joel, growth cut from 2% to 1% this year feels like quite a big deal, and then up a little bit in future years, but is that anything more than just a bounce back from underperforming this year? And what did you make of both that and the other figures about debt, fiscal headroom and all the rest of it?
OK, so I think, firstly on growth, I think the criticism of the OBR that has, over the years, has been, of all the forecasters, it is the most optimistic. What we've had is a very significant growth downgrade this year. The economy will grow half as fast as the OBR was expecting just 6 months ago. But then, because the OBR assumes that the potential, as is relating to what Robert was saying about productivity, the potential growth rate of the economy is 1.6, 1.7% a year. It assumes that there's this kind of bounce back so that you have weak growth one year, stronger growth the next, and 5 years out we are pretty much back to where we started again. This assumption that the natural run rate, the trend growth rate of the British economy is 1.6, 1.7%, is being challenged, and people are sceptical about that. The Bank of England thinks it's a lot lower. And I think one of the questions we had ahead of this is, was the OBR going to make an adjustment to that figure? Because if it does, and let's be clear, the British economy hasn't grown by 1.6% on a sustained basis for the last 15 years, Tom. If it does downgrade that figure in the autumn, then another hole will emerge in the public finances, and quite a big one, potentially, that will need filling. I mean, more generally, she came up with a figure that was really eye-catching about claiming that the average household was going to feel £500 a year better off. She attributed that to the Office for Budget Responsibility. I can find no reference to it directly in the OBR's report, but we're still going through it. The OBR does say that real household disposable income, which is a measure of living standards, I suppose, which it uses, will increase by 0.5% a year on average over the course of this Parliament, due in part to strong wage growth. The criticism of this measure, though, which even the OBR would accept, is it doesn't make big adjustments for housing costs. So it will take account of mortgage rates, rent, it makes an accommodation for rent, but doesn't, and energy bills. But if you speak to people like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, they will say this measure does not reflect people's lived experience.
OK, Robert, you want to
go in? Just to be clear on that 0.5%, I mean, that is its measure of living standards, and actually it's pretty much identical to what it said in October. You had Rachel Reeves saying, yippee, living standards are rising. 0.5% a year is trivial, but, compared to both, previous parliaments, if we go back in recent history, and it goes against the backdrop of almost no increase in living standards during the last parliament. So it's slightly weird that she's swaggering about an increase in living standards that most people won't feel. But there's one other point that I just think it is just worth stressing here. The OBR makes, right at the top of its report, it puts a massive health warning on its forecast. What it says is that if the projected recovery in UK productivity growth, which it is currently, productivity lower by 1%, I said earlier, than it was originally, but it still thinks productivity will gradually recover. It says if it fails to materialise, and actually just recent trends in productivity growth are continued, then we will be back, or the government will be back in the red very significantly very soon if interest rates rise even a tiny amount more than the government is currently hoping. Again, massively back in the red. And so, she is in building in so little headroom, which is a sort of protection against shocks today. She is genuinely taking a very risky bet that somehow things, in a Trump world, she's basically saying things are going to be predictable and stable. Well, the experience of all of us of Trump is that nothing is going to be predictable and stable. And so when you read this report, you do come away thinking there is a massively high risk that come the autumn, taxes are going to have to go up.
Trump, the great unmentioned word in British politics at the moment. I think I've still yet to see any member of the government ever criticise anything he's done. Maybe that's a subject we'll get to later. Anushka, a lot of people watching this at home, I think, will be thinking, OK, so what you're saying is growth not great this year, might improve a bit after that, as Joel was saying, not absolutely clear that that's terribly good news. Rachel Reeves obviously saying her plans to build will make a difference. Let's see. But the bona fide truth we can't ignore in all of this is that lots of people watching this programme are going to experience spending cuts so she can maintain her fiscal headroom. We've only had the envelope. We don't know where they are individually going to fall. But first of all, I wanted to ask you, there were no surprises in there for you. You've covered this a lot. There were no surprises for you, were there, as far as I could tell? And secondly, what do you think this is really going to mean for people watching this programme? What kinds of things are they going to be impacted by?
Well, I think if we look at two areas in that, so the envelope that you're talking about, like I say, that was squeezed, but probably slightly less than some people thought it might be squeezed, which will lead to some protections. Nevertheless, that is going to result in money coming out of departments that we were expecting to go into them over the next few years. You know, we know that they believe that they're going to be judged on how the NHS performs. And so the money is going into the NHS, and it would be reasonable to assume that it continues in that way. We know they want to protect schools, and we also now know that they want to increase defence, although we're saying that 3% getting to defence, they're under pressure to do that more quickly, and they have knocked that into the next Parliament, which means it doesn't need to mess with the figures.
Sorry to interrupt you on that. Is that politically sustainable in your view, delaying defence spending to 3% till the next Parliament when we can see the crisis unfolding around us on a daily basis?
I think it is very difficult to sustain it, but I also think it's very difficult to achieve it. You know, I showed you that. Look at how much of an extra impact it made when I said this is what it looks like if you get to 3% by 2030, if you actually confirm it by then. It went up from a 14.8 billion squeeze on unprotected departments to a squeeze of over 25 billion, according to the Resolution Foundation. So what are those departments? You know, you think about, you know, the Ministry of Justice. From what I'm hearing, there are really difficult conversations going on behind the scenes about, well, you might need to let more people out of jail. Who are you going to let out of jail? And what exactly crimes might they have committed? And how's the public going to react to that? I mean, we've talked loads about local government. Local government covers things like SEN children. You know, the government has a real headache on its hands right now because it's going to have to try to reform the SEN system rather than, you know, just cut it. And parents who have children with disabilities are going to fight hard against that.
And many people would argue that local government is already on its knees.
On its knees. I mean, I have not spoken to a single chief executive of a council across the country who does not tell me they are suffering really hard. Children's services, you know, adult social care very hard. And then, obviously, on the side of that, we also have the welfare package that we've talked about quite a lot. Harder. And already I've had a text just now from an MP, from a Labour MP, saying they just can't think that this is an acceptable package, an extra £500 million than they were planning to do. And there is such frustration with the OBR, with government insiders when I talk to them. They are not going to slag the OBR off in public. They, you know, came in saying...
That's not going to end well for them.
No, and also they came in saying, we're not going to do a Liz Truss, we have to protect the OBR. Very quickly, they're like, the OBR is predicting these things that we don't like. On welfare, just looking at the OBR outlook quickly, it seems that they feel they got the stuff too late, they're not able to properly drill into it yet, they've been quite cautious in terms of what's going to happen. For what it's worth, I believe that the Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall, didn't want to even announce the package until after the spring statement, but she was forced to do so. But, you know, the OBR is making one set of predictions. Government economists are making another. The New Economics Foundation, who we've been doing work with, actually agree with the government over the OBR. But these are all predictions, they're all forecasts. And what people inside government say to me is, on the basis of those forecasts, we have to go and make real decisions that are going to hit real people. And in the case of welfare, hit them pretty hard.
OK, it's probably worth saying about the OBR, if you're wondering what on earth the OBR is. What used to happen in the days when Gordon Brown was Chancellor is he'd issue his budget, all the numbers were effectively crunched in-house, and then you'd go the very next day to the Institute for Fiscal Studies and they would deliver their alternative budget and they would say, hey, guess what? The Chancellor didn't tell you yesterday, and that would create almost an even bigger story on certain days, particularly the 10p tax rate. If you're old enough, you may remember that. And George Osborne decided this was not a very good idea to do business, and so he set up the OBR as an independent body that effectively is the government's outside numbers watchdog, if I'm explaining this correctly. That is at least my memory of it. And of course, people have sometimes come to regret that. But, you know, it's not easy either way. Joel, I want to come back to you. We've talked a lot about growth. I can see you number crunching here. What have you concluded?
Well, yeah, I mean, let's just go through, I think, some of the key judgments that the Office for Budget Responsibility made, some of which I think will be seen as slightly controversial. Let's start with the growth forecast that it's got. This is how it thinks the UK economy is going to perform. What you can see there, it's the difference between the October forecast at the budget and what the OBR is saying now. So you can see this year, 2025, it's halved the growth rate of the British economy. The British economy has barely grown at all in the last 7 months.
Can I stop you for a moment there and explain why?
Bottom line, there's a lot of moving parts here, but the bottom line is, economic activity just hasn't been as strong. All the sort of dials are kind of pointing slightly in the wrong direction. Inflation has come in higher than the OBRs expected, so that's been upward pressure on prices. Businesses and consumers haven't been spending in the way that the Office for Budget Responsibility had assumed that they would, and the Bank of England has said almost as much. So, a weak growth figure for 2025, but thereafter, you've got an assumption that we bounce back to really quite high levels of growth, certainly by recent standards. The Office of Budget Responsibility has trend growth in the United Kingdom. The steady run rate, it assumes, if the British economy is firing on normal cylinders, it can grow by 1.6%. We haven't seen growth like that for years. So I would describe that forecast we've got today as optimistic. But look, hey, let's hope it does come to pass. Let's look at debt. This is why we need to hope it comes to pass, because the amount of money the British government is now
optimistic
spending...
in inverted commas, Joel.
No. I'm a glass half full man.
Well,
hope dies last, Tom Bradby.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of, look at the debt, the amount of debt we are spending as a nation to service the interest we're spending to service debt and refinance debt. Again, it's ticking up again. By the end of the forecast period, we will be spending £131 billion a year servicing our national debt. This year, just gone, 24-25, £105 billion. Let's put that in context for you, looking at what the government's spending on debt interest. It can't spend in other areas of government. I think we can show you now, just put that £105 billion figure in some sort of context. Look at how that compares. If we can just move the chart. I know there's a bubble chart here. I'm very excited. Any minute now, it's going to animate on.
We love a bubble chart.
There he goes.
Yeah.
So you can see, look at that, £105 billion worth of debt interest payments. That's bigger than the entire education budget in England. Look at the Home Office budget. It's tiny. Look at what we're spending on defence. We're having this debate now about how does the government get defence spending up to 3% of GDP. That's what we're spending currently. It dwarfs all of those. I think that's the reality that we've got to get our heads around, yeah? It's that just 4 years ago, debt interest spending was around 40 billion. Today, it's over 100 billion and growing. We desperately need inflation to come back under control and interest rates to come down in terms of the public finances.
I enjoyed your bubble chart, just saying. We're going to come back and hear what Robert's got to say about all that in just a moment, and particularly given that he has repeatedly warned of his worries about the world economy, about whether any of these numbers are realistic and what it means if they're not. But we will see you the other side of this short break.
If they have no plan, let me remind them about ours. The minimum wage up, real wages up, house building up, NHS investment up, investment in our schools up, investment in our roads up, defence spending up. Every single one of those policies opposed by the party opposite. Opposed by the Conservatives, opposed by Reform, opposed by the SNP, opposed by the Liberal Democrats and opposed by the Greens. Mr Speaker, it's the anti-growth coalition in action. They are the blockers, we are the builders, securing Britain's future, protecting working people and delivering change.
Chair of the Finance Committee, Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend inherited a very difficult challenge when she became Chancellor of the Exchequer last July. And she is absolutely right that the books need to balance. This is not other people's money we're spending, but taxpayers' money hard earned by our constituents, and she is right to be tough as Chancellor on this. We look forward to quizzing her at the Treasury Select Committee next week. I'm sure she's looking forward to it as much as we are. Mr Speaker, the Chancellor announced an extra £2 billion a year in capital spending, and she talked about extra defence spending. Can she give some more detail about where she hopes that £2 billion a year extra will go?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I indeed look forward to attending the Treasury Select Committee next week. I was pleased to have served on the Treasury Select Committee in the past, and it's a pleasure to give evidence to you. We will set out in the spending review, my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, will set out in the spending review the allocation of the additional capital money. But I was able to announce today £2.2 billion into defence from next year, as well as £2 billion as a down payment to build the affordable and social housing that we need. Two examples of the priorities of this government to get Britain building and to secure our national security.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of this country are crying out for change, but they feel they're just getting more of the same. Of course, it was the Conservative Party that wrecked the public finances, but we are 8 months into the new government, and people are left wondering, where is the change that was promised? The Chancellor says that the world is changing, so why won't she change course with it? The Chancellor said she wanted a dash for growth, but with her national insurance jobs tax, she shot herself in the foot before she even crossed the start line. After the government's disastrous budget, the government had the chance today to change direction, to fix our finances, to kickstart growth and deliver a small business budget. The government could have scrapped the jobs tax, which will hammer our high streets, and instead ask the big banks, the social media giants and the online gambling companies to pay their fair share instead. And the government could have changed its approach to trade, launching talks to boost growth with a new trading deal with our European neighbours. Instead, the government has made the wrong decisions to cut public services, hit disabled people and inflict more pain on our small businesses and high streets.
You will see Anushka and Robert and Joel often to be found talking about their worries about the global economy in particular, the trade wars, the tariffs, a lot of consumer confidence surveys starting now to head in slightly alarming directions in terms of the indices. Of course, certainly the American stock market has been having a pretty torrid time, particularly if you're a Tesla investor. Not a good time for that. Robert, can I just ask you, I guess a question, given all that a lot of people watching this might have is, well, is any of that realistic? Do those growth figures seem realistic to you? Are we in for another nasty year of unhappy surprises on the economy?
I mean, look, I am genuinely surprised that the OBR upgraded its growth forecast for next year, given the way that pretty much every other forecaster is downgrading both for this year and next year because of all the uncertainty that Donald Trump has caused with tariffs, well, actual pain that he's causing with tariffs that are actually being implemented and, tremendous anxieties, both in governments and businesses about future pain if he imposes the tariffs that he is threatening. Now, this is a very important economic announcement. There are really also fantastically important economic negotiations going on between the British government and the American government because Donald Trump is saying that on April the 2nd, he will announce tariffs for all of America's major trading partners, including the UK, and the Department for Business is engaged in really tense negotiations with American officials about trying to limit the tariffs that are going to be imposed on the UK. One of the things that is in play, not talked about today by Rachel Reeves, is the £800 million a year that the government raises from a digital services tax. That is a tax imposed on the world's digital giants like Amazon and Google. The Americans want it scrapped. It is staggering to me that the British government is even engaging in these negotiations because this is basically Washington dictating to us our taxes, which I think most people would say is outrageous. But the British government is engaging in these negotiations because they don't want the tariffs and they are genuinely thinking, well, maybe if we give them what they want in terms of the digital sales tax, they won't penalise us too hard. Most of us would say they should tell Trump to take a running jump and actually join forces with other Western governments and basically say to Washington, you impose tariffs of X, we will retaliate with tariffs of 2X. At that point, American businesses would absolutely panic, and I'm not sure Trump could continue. But there isn't that kind of coordination at the moment between Western governments. All of this shows you is the degree of uncertainty that is out there. And I have to say, just one final point. This is not a robust package, right, that she's announced today. I've talked about how little buffer there is in there for the OBR's very optimistic growth forecast not to materialise. I've also just seen in here that in these figures, she says no return to austerity. She has written into these figures that between 2028 and 2030, day-to-day spending for all departments will be cut, right? It never happens, right? Day-to-day spending for departments is never cut. So if you look at these and you just think, this is just not realistic. They're just painting this in so they can hit their fiscal target. But to be truthful, you know, this looks to me like pretty good fiction.
My God, the Treasury are going to love us today. Look forward to the phone calls when we get off air. Look, when Robert was talking there, I had like about 5 questions I wanted to ask. You may have done the same to him and to Joel and to Anushka, and we've got quite a bit of time left, so I will get to put some of them. But if you're wondering thinking, OK, this is all very interesting, but tell us what actually happened. Here's a summary.
Are you in panic mode, Chancellor?
Today marks another big test for Rachel Reeves. Months after her first budget, she's back in the Commons. Warning instability abroad means tough choices at home.
Now our task is to secure Britain's future in a world that is changing before our eyes. The threat facing our continent was transformed when Putin invaded Ukraine. It has since escalated further and will continue to evolve rapidly. At the same time, the global economy has become more uncertain.
As she warned, the OBR has put forward a gloomy economic outlook.
The OBR have today revised down our growth forecast for 2025, from 2% in the autumn to 1% today. I am not satisfied with these numbers, and that is why we on this side of the House are serious about taking the action needed to grow our economy. Backing the builders, not the blockers, with a third runway at Heathrow Airport and the planning and infrastructure bill.
And the Chancellor admitted that upcoming changes to welfare will save £3.4 billion, less than expected, and leaving the door open for further cuts.
We are reforming our welfare system, making it more sustainable, protecting the most vulnerable, and most importantly, supporting more people back into secure work, lifting them out of poverty.
She confirmed cuts to the civil service, but argued capital spending would be protected.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm to the House that day-to-day spending will increase in real terms above inflation in every single year of the forecast. And in the spending review, apart from the reductions in overseas aid, day-to-day spending across government has been fully protected.
The Tories say the Chancellor's been forced into these decisions by her own political mistakes.
Right Honourable Lady, Mr. Speaker, says, of course, that none of this is her fault. It is the war in Ukraine. It is President Trump. It is tariffs. It is President Putin. It is the Conservatives. It is her legacy. It is anybody but her. But what the British people know, Mr. Speaker, is that this is a consequence of her choices.
The government says this isn't a return to austerity. But the big question is whether their MPs and the public are convinced. Jasmine Cameron-Chaleshi, ITV News, Westminster.
Well, if those were the highlights, if that's the right word at this point, let's go to Harry down at Westminster to see what MPs have been saying about it. Harry, over to you.
Yeah, well, the Chancellor is still taking questions from MPs. We're just getting to the first few Labour backbenchers having their say on her statement today. Many of them were deeply uncomfortable heading into this statement about the prospects of the changes that she was announcing today, in particular on welfare spending. We heard the Chancellor say in that statement that there was nothing Labour about working people paying the price for economic responsibility. I think many Labour backbenchers feel that in cutting welfare spending that working people are paying the price for that economic responsibility. And of course, there were further cuts to welfare spending announced today. That will be very upsetting for many Labour MPs. The other thing, of course, is that there will be more uncomfortable news to come. We know that the spending review in June will see lots of departments having to make difficult choices about what sort of spending to focus on. I've had a couple of MPs have texted me saying they were quite pleased with what the Chancellor had to say when it comes to the OBR forecasts on growth and living standards. They might be a little bit less pleased when they read the OBR's own analysis rather than the Chancellor's interpretation of it.
OK, Harry, thank you very much. Joel, I want to come back to you. Robert, describing this as basically fiction. Do you agree? And can I ask you particularly to talk about tariffs and their overall impact, and also what the impact would be if countries like Canada and Europe, organisations like the European Union and Canada, countries like Canada, I should be, to be more specific, and us, maybe got together and to counter it? Would that work, or would that just create more problems?
Well, Robert's scepticism was pinned to the headroom that the Chancellor's left herself again. She's restored it back to about £10 billion, which in the context of an economy of £2 trillion and government spending of £1 trillion is tiny and is a fraction of the headroom that previous chancellors have left. It's about a third. So there's not, again, she's restored not very much wiggle room. Put another way, she's taking a gamble that she'll be lucky. She wasn't lucky 6 months ago. She may not be lucky again. And goodness, she's been referring to the global uncertainty. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a lot, actually. The Office of Budget Responsibility has 3 suggestions. It points out that if the economy does not recover in the way that it is forecasting, if indeed the economy continues to perform as it has done for the last few years, that actually come the end of the forecast period, there will be a hole in the government finances of around £30 billion that will need filling. Goodness. Point number 2, if the government's borrowing costs continue to increase. Let's remember, Tom, the Chancellor was saying there, we've had 3 interest rate cuts since Labour came to power. Absolutely true. And the government's borrowing costs have gone up, not down. Yeah, the markets, in that sense, have taken a dimmer view of, or see the UK as perceived as being more risky. If gilt yields and bank rate rise by 0.6 percentage points, the OBR points out all of the headroom will be gone. If a trade war escalates in the way that we don't know what's going to happen next, but in the way that it could, to the extent that we end up with tariffs of 20% imposed on US imports and other countries reciprocate, the UK GDP would fall by around 1%, and it would reduce the headroom that Robert was flagging to 0 in the target year. So there's an awful lot that could go wrong. Rachel Reeves was there talking about a world that has changed. And let's be clear about what she means by that. What she means, in many ways, is Donald Trump. She means that European governments are going to have to spend more on defence than she imagined back at the time of the budget. It means that European governments are paying more to borrow money than they were back at the budget. And it means that Donald Trump is threatening to escalate a trade conflict, which will have a sedative impact on growth. All of those things are true, but the UK does look really exposed.
Anushka, how worried are government ministers, in your view, about the potential impact of tariffs? How worried are you, as somebody who's covered politics and economics your whole life, about the impact of tariffs, and how real do you think the threat is?
I really can't overstate how worried they are. I've had a few conversations in the last few days where very senior figures were telling me they're not really worrying about this right now. What they're worrying about is America and how to try and deal with that. And since the moment that Trump has been elected, they've been trying to build relations, trying to get us treated differently. There's a particular link through Mark Burnett, the guy who was the apprentice TV producer who's now the envoy to the UK. It sounds like there's quite a personal relationship that has been built there between him and people in Downing Street. They are quite hopeful that they might get a carve-out on tariffs. We've seen Johnny Reynolds in the US recently trying to change that. We know that they may do something quite controversial, which is move on the digital services tax for America in order to try and resist it. They think it would be an absolute blow to our economy. And it's worth saying they think that regardless of whether they put tariffs on the UK in terms of steel, anything on the EU is going to have a big negative impact on the UK economy. And that is actually what they're worrying about over everything else. And of course, I get what Robert's saying about when he describes some of these things as fiction. Look, any Chancellor, when they're standing up at the dispatch box, isn't going to give you all the gory details from the OBR book. They try and put a positive gloss on it. The £9.9 billion headroom that she's going to hold is quite small. And I noticed that the OBR say she's only actually got a 54% chance of sticking to her fiscal rules by the end of the Parliament. There's some difficult decisions along the way. Labour MPs say to me, we didn't come into politics to take money off pensioners or disabled people. So there's a political difficulty that is coming down the track. But they are hopeful that they can start to change things. They're hopeful that they can think more long-termist about all of this. And they would say, as I said before, it isn't austerity in the form that we have seen over the past decade and a half.
Robert, can I just come back to you? And I just want to ask you, because you were talking a little bit there about tariffs and all the rest of it. And I think one of the questions people watching this will have is like, OK, you talked about the digital services tax and how which I think we'd all agree is going to be very unpopular if they lift it. Like, do we have a choice but to basically sit there pleading with the Americans? Or is there the possibility of greater cooperation with like the Canadians and the Europeans? Does that make any difference? Paint us a picture of what our choices really are in your view.
Look, the good news is that there is definitely now a move towards coordination on trade, defence, between what you might call the G6, which are the world's most powerful democracies, except, leaving out America, right? This is basically the rich democratic world versus America. And over time...
Can't believe we're having this conversation, by the way. I mean, it just blows your mind, doesn't it? Anyway, sorry, carry on.
And I think over time, that will yield benefits, both in terms of our security and our economic prospects. But as we've all seen over decades of covering this stuff, getting world leaders to respond to an immediate crisis is like herding cats. And one of the reasons Trump is causing so much anxiety across the world is that he has very astutely decided to pick off each country one by one. And at the moment, the EU is having separate negotiations. We're having separate negotiations. Canada is having separate negotiations. As I say, my view is we should all come together and call his bluff. It's not happening at the moment. Britain is relative to pretty much every developed economy you can think of, we're a very open economy, which is one of the reasons why ministers, as Anushka says, are so anxious about these tariffs. I really hope that we don't buckle on either the digital services tax or any tax, because I think it creates a really appalling precedent in respect of Washington essentially encroaching on what most people would regard as British sovereignty. So I really hope we don't do that. The other things that are being negotiated are, for example, and this is again very controversial, America is again picking up this whole issue of access to British markets of American food, and that agriculture is in play. Again, if British consumers think that we're taking stuff that is unhealthy, we had the sort of famous chlorinated chicken controversy over many years. If that comes back, that will be very controversial. There are just days left of this, and the stakes genuinely could not be higher.
OK, we haven't got long left, but Joel, I'm going to ask you to give us the one thing we haven't had so far, which is market reaction.
Yeah, the last thing a Chancellor wants is her head on the front of a vegetable on the front of a tabloid newspaper. So the market reaction, as you can see, I think probably the Chancellor would be reasonably happy with that. It looks like a jump in bond yields. In fact, what that's telling you is that the yield on UK 10-year debt still hovering around 4.7%. Not really a very large reaction. Let me leave you the word with Paul Paul Dales, Capital Economics, says the slim buffer and growing economic risks, possible unrealistic spending squeeze, the need for more defence spending all suggest that more action will be needed down the line. Markets will feel there's unfinished fiscal business.
You've got 15 seconds.
Well, I just want to, because we've been talking a lot about, we haven't talked enough possibly about welfare. In the Treasury's own book, it's got two numbers which are semi-new. The Treasury is factoring in $4.5 billion of savings from making it harder to get personal independence savings. To get the personal independence support for the disabled people, and more than $3 billion raised from halving the rate of health-related universal credit payments. So for the disabled, this is a really tough and anxiety-inducing package.
OK, Anushka, I just need to give you the last word today. How about that? You've done so much about spending. You've revealed a great deal of what they were planning to do. Were you surprised in any way by what you heard today? And what's your overall impression of it?
Well, I don't think there were any huge surprises today, partly because we knew about, things that were coming out. On welfare, they have just put out their impact assessment. And so I just think it is worth saying on that. It looks like 800,000 people could be in line to lose personal independence payments, 370,000 who currently have them when they come up for reassessments. That is going to be a blow. We've spent years investigating this benefit, and I can tell you the people who get it find the whole system extremely challenging, extremely difficult, and that is going to be coming down the line. Those people are going to be writing to their MPs, and this all has to go to a vote in Parliament because it requires legislation.
OK, that is sadly all we have time for this lunchtime. When Rachel Reeves delivered the budget only a few months ago, we thought that was it in terms of big economic events. As you've seen from this discussion, it is very much not so. For much more, do join me and the team on News at 10 tonight. But for now, thank you very much indeed for giving us your time and listening to us. Goodbye.